this second day of the ACS Institute. Okay, no?
Sound check.
Good morning, I'm Brett Neilson. Welcome to the second day of the ACS Institute. It gives me great pleasure to introduce my good friend, Sandro Mezzadra, to deliver the second keynote address. Sandro is a professor of political theory in the Department of Arts at the University of Bologna, and he's also an adjunct professor at the Institute for Culture and Society at Western Sydney University, where I work. As many of you know, Sandro and I have been producing text together for many years. I thought I might mention some of Sandro's other works by means of introduction. Sandro is an author of a book in Italian called Diritto di fuga. It means the right to escape. It's about migration and globalization, published in 2006. La condizione postcoloniale, the postcolonial condition, was published 2009, 7, 8. Oh, okay, good.
Very close.
But also by way of introduction, I want to mention two things that Sandro has written recently. One with me, which is a book that will come out with Verso next year. It's called The Rest and the West, Capital and Power in a Multipolar World. And the other work is co-authored with Michael Hart. It is called Bolivia Beyond the Impasse, which should come out, well, let's say any moment, but that may mean a long time, with the press Common Notions. So I'll hand over to Sandro to deliver the keynote speech. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brett. Good morning. Thank you very much, Brett, for introducing me. Indeed, it is kind of weird to be introduced and chaired by Brett, because, as he was saying, we have been closely working together for 20 years now. And above all, because my talk today is based on the book we just finished to write, The Rest and the West. Brett mentioned it. So there is a kind of sharing responsibility between the speaker and the chair of the session. Allow me to start by warmly thanking the organizer of the ACS Institute for inviting me. And my personal thank goes in particular to Professor Joyce Liu, who first reached out to me and kindly shared with me reading suggestions, including her own essays, that build an essential guide to what is indeed my second visit to Taiwan. Let me add that I was also struck by the project that was launched yesterday, the Transit Asia Research Network. And this is because it seems to me that it is predicated upon an understanding of regional spaces that is quite close to the way in which I will try to reframe internationalism in my talk today. Decolonization in the 21st century is the topic we are called to discuss at this year's ACS Institute. As I anticipated with my title, I will tackle this question from a specific angle, which means the need to reframe internationalism in the tumultuous transition we are currently living through at the global level. In doing that, I remain aware of the roles played by multiple forms and practices of internationalism in the historical process of decolonization. And by focusing on the need to rethink internationalism in the present conjuncture, I emphasize both the distinctiveness of the problems we face today, which implies a discontinuity with that legacy, and the fact that struggles of decolonization are an ongoing process. In an age of pandemic and war, I will attempt to provide at least the prolegomena for the rethinking of internationalism, reflecting upon some of the theoretical problems and pitfalls it raises. In doing so, as I was saying, I will share with you and in a way test some ideas I have been recently elaborating with Brett for the Rest and the West, the new book that will come out somewhere in the next future from Brett. Rethinking internationalism is the urgent and difficult task we outline in that book, based on an analysis of the mutations of global capitalism in an age of pandemic and war, as well as of specific recent struggles in different parts of the world. I have a paper with me, but I will not read it. I will rather summarize it. Reading papers is not part of my academic training. I remember when I was a student in Italy in the 1980s, when somebody showed up at a conference and started reading a paper, people were annoyed. They thought it was boring. In a way, in Italy, you always need a bit of theater, and if you read a paper, there is no theater. So I don't know if I will provide some kind of theater, but I will not read the paper. In the book that I mentioned, Brett and I analyze mutations of capitalism from the angle of the tumultuous transformations that are reshaping the world system in an age of pandemic and war. One of the stakes of the book is the vexed question of globalization. We ask ourselves whether globalization is really over, and I can anticipate that our answer to that question is quite negative. But let me say something at the start about the way in which I look at the problem of internationalism. What really interests me is the attempt to forge theoretical and political tools to imagine a politics of freedom and equality that is necessarily a politics of struggles across nations, regions, and continents. I think this question has long been around in critical debates over the last couple of decades. Think, for instance, of the discussion of cosmopolitanism in the 1990s, of the work of such scholars as Arjuna Padurai or Paul Gilroy, who reframed cosmopolitanism from below as a vernacular force. One of the things one can say about those theoretical efforts is that they were, at least implicitly, attempts to reply to the critique of cosmopolitanism articulated in the late 1920s by Antonio Gramsci. You will remember that Antonio Gramsci criticized cosmopolitanism for being a kind of abstract universalism, while internationalism, in Gramsci's opinion, was not abstract because of the concrete mediation of the nation. Well, debates surrounding cosmopolitanism that started in the 1990s were also attempts to ground cosmopolitanism, to give a grounding, to give a concrete basis, usually in movements of migration and other practices of mobility, cosmopolitanism. But let me come closer to my own theoretical framework and political experiences. You will remember the book by Tony Negri and Michael Hart, Empire, that came out in 2000. In that book, there is a reference to what the authors call the paradox of incommunicability of struggles. What does paradox of incommunicability of struggles mean? It means that it has become increasingly more difficult to find a common ground between different struggles played out in different parts of the world, but more often than not, even in the same city. So it is to tackle this paradox of incommunicability that continues to haunt us in a conjuncture of pandemic and war, that Brett and I turned to the issue of internationalism. But I have to pause now and to say something about the word internationalism and the political history of internationalism. Internationalism was an extraordinary political invention in the mid-19th century in Europe. No less than Jacques Derrida emphasized that. For the first time, there was a movement that presented itself as geopolitical, Derrida writes. I think about the situation in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s when Marx starts to write on internationalism. The process of nationalization of the state and the political map was far from accomplished in Europe. So internationalism was an anticipation of a process far from being accomplished and an attempt to subvert it. But what about today? I think that we have to be kind of realistic, and we have to acknowledge that the history of communist, socialist, and even anarchist internationalism has been predicated upon the nation as a fundamental unit of organization. Is this still valid today? I do not think this is the case. And this is an important point, even beyond the fact that the history of communist internationalism in the 20th century has been crisscrossed by extraordinary episodes of solidarity, but it has also been kind of perverted by the submission of internationalism to the national interest of the USSR. The civil war in Spain that was mentioned by Ranavir yesterday is, of course, a dramatic instance in this respect. So this is to say that the very name international is a kind of controversial name today. I'm not sure, I mean, this name as a political future. Maybe we need another powerful political invention today. But what remains with us is the problem of international. I would like to describe this problem in very simple, although not uncontroversial terms. The problem of internationalism is to forge a language, a common language, capable to address different, heterogeneous forms of exploitation and domination, while at the same time articulating a common desire for liberation. It is simple but not uncontroversial, as I did, and will add back to this definition of the process of the problem of internationalism at the end of my talk. Needless to say, here is also the possibility to go through the historical archives of internationalism to excavate experiences and moments in which internationalism has been politically articulated beyond the nation. And the history of anti-colonial internationalism is particularly significant here. I can say more on that in the Q&A session if you wish. But now I must come to our present, to the challenges and conflicts of our present. And let me say that in doing that, I follow the experience and the lesson of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. I'm tempted to quip that we should use Lenin as method, particularly in the title book I wrote some years back with Brett. As a method. Be clear, I do not think that Lenin's theory of imperialism has much to say to us today. Capitalism has dramatically changed even the political landscape we face today is difficult to compare with the one that Lenin had in mind. But his struggle during the Great War, his fight to include the geopolitical factors within his understanding of class struggle in a conjuncture of unprecedented war and large-scale massacres in Europe remains inspiring. It is precisely this articulation between quote and unquote geopolitics and social struggles that becomes again crucial today in a completely different situation. So how to make sense of the fractures and conflicts of the international system today? We need an analysis of the fractures and conflicts of the international system, of the world system today, in order to articulate at least an attempt to rethink international. We know that in mainstream debates in many parts of the world, the first reply to the question I just asked is to say that globalization is over. So we are kind of haunted by such words like decoupling, reshoring, nearshoring, and this started with the pandemic and has been intensified with Russia's invasion of Ukraine last year. My take, our take on this question is quite different, and it is based on a distinction that we formulated several years ago in both take for granted that all its components are perfectly integrated within a system of economic, political, cultural forces. If you look at global processes, and I will give a couple of examples later on, the situation is quite different because global processes can articulate with each other, but they can also generate frictions. You cannot take for granted that global processes are part of a whole. And we are convinced that global processes continue to shape, operations of capital, which means the daily life of billions of people on this planet. Let me say just a word on globalization. My sense is that in public debates, and quite often also in academic debates, globalization is understood along the lines that were set up by debates of the 1990s. And particularly what matters more, speaking of globalization, is for many people the degree of opening of economies to trade exchanges, to foreign trade. I think this is kind of bias in contemporary discussions of globalization. And I think that we have to move beyond such understanding of globalization. Let me mention an important point. In the 1990s, it was taken for granted that the US was going to dominate globalization in the next century. The new American century was a phrase circulating very much in the 1990s. The American unipolar age and the like. I think that at least since the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008, we have to take stock of the fact that the US global hegemony is in crisis. And this is the reason why we harked back to the work of Giovanni Arrighi, who already in the early 1990s was saying that the real plot developing against the background of globalization was the crisis of US global hegemony. You know, at the time, I must say, I didn't take it seriously. But over the last year, particularly after reading his last great book, Adam Smith in Beijing, I changed my mind. I changed my mind and I started to read Arrighi's diagnosis of a crisis of US global hegemony, along with the work of other scholars who added something to this diagnosis. I'm thinking, for instance, of Stuart Hall's essays on globalization in the 1990s, where he emphasized that along what he called globalization from above, we have to take notice of a powerful movement of globalization from below, connected to migratory movements in particular, that was prompting a slow process of decentering of the West. But let me mention at least another scholar, very close to us, which means Naoki Sakai. Naoki's work on the end of Pax Americana is another important source of inspiration for us, in particular because it allows qualifying a bit the diagnosis of a crisis of U.S. global hegemony. Since this is a kind of important point, let me add a couple of qualifications to this diagnosis. Talking about a crisis of U.S. global hegemony does not mean, firstly, the collapse of civilization. It does not resonate with the passing of a great race or with the decline of the West, to remind the titles of two quite infamous books that came out in the years of the Great War, written by Mezzadra and Franklin. A second qualification, quoting Machiavelli on the main sources of political power, one could contend that weapons and money firmly remain in U.S. hands. And this is true for weapons. The string of pearls of circa 600 military bases of the U.S. around the world. While it has become more complicated for money, with the erosion of the dollar-based international system, with increasing processes of de-dollarization, and with the emergence of the new development banks of the BRICS. Further one qualification. Once it is understood in terms of the weakening of the capacity of the U.S. to guide at the global level, the crisis of U.S. global hegemony is often taken as a matter of fact in the U.S. debate in international relations. As you may see, taking a look at the last issues of the journal Foreign Affairs. What is important to me is that the crisis of U.S. global hegemony has as one of its main effects that war is today at the center of the global dimension, and not anymore at its margins, as a scramble to control global processes and space, which makes a huge difference again with respect to the 1990s. And to conclude these qualifications of Arrighi's diagnosis, in this scenario, the West, quote and unquote, dismisses the claim to universality that historically constituted it and positions itself increasingly as a part. United West, divided from the rest, is the title of a report released last February by the European Council on Foreign Relations on global public opinion's attitudes toward the war in Ukraine. The West is increasingly united, but separated from the rest of the world, where other kind of perspectives on the Ukraine war prevail. And this is a further factor of fragmentation of the global space. And this is also because the rest mentioned here, as well as in the title of our book, is far from being homogeneous. So, as I was saying, we kind of take seriously Arrighi's diagnosis of the crisis of U.S. global hegemony. But I have to add that we remain wary of any prospect of a straightforward hegemonic transition, say to China as the new hegemon. In a way, we have the impression that the very language of hegemony at the world scale is kind of exhausted. And this is because our analysis of contemporary capitalism points to a set of processes and logics, to a rationality driving processes of valorization and accumulation that exist in tension with what Arrighi calls territorialism. And as you may know, the perspective of hegemony in the world system is based on the possibility of a kind of combination between the logic of territorialism, which means the action of territorial powers, states, empires, and the logic of capital. That was possible in the past, maybe it is much more difficult today. It is from this point of view that we kind of test and reframe in our book the notion of multipolarity. Maybe this can be another point to be discussed in these days. Multipolarity is a controversial notion. We are well aware of that. It is a controversial notion not only because it is used by the Putin regime to justify the imperialist aggression towards Ukraine, but Putin takes multipolarity as a kind of vision for the future, while we say that we already live in a multipolar world. It is quite interesting to look at the work of one of Putin's ideologues, which means Alexander Dugin. I guess the name belongs here. Dugin published a book in English in 2021, bearing the title A Theory of Multipolarity. It's a kind of scaling book because the poles about which Dugin speaks are entirely constructed in civilizational terms that coincide with civilizations. And civilizations are understood in reactionary, in explicitly reactionary terms. It's a kind of revival of Samuel Huntington, who is explicitly celebrated by Dewey in that book. As you can easily imagine, we take a radical distance from this kind of civilization reflection of multipolarity that often resonates with some approaches in postcolonial and decolonial studies. But we also take a distance from the multiple uses of the language of polarity in international relations. You know, in international relations, particularly in the US, at least since the end of the Second World War, there is a kind of tendency to play with the language of polarity, to construct models of unipolar, bipolar, multipolar international systems and to ask questions about the respective stability and so on of each of them. Which is, for us, the main problem in such exercises. The main problem is that international relations, at least in its mainstream, takes states' territorial powers as the exclusive actors in the realm of world politics. And what we try to do with the concept of multipolarity is completely different. First of all, we problematize the very notion of pole. And we ask, what is a pole? What is a pole? We focus not that much on established poles, but rather on processes of pole formation. And we distinguish different quote-unquote layers in the processes of pole formation. Of course, territorial powers play outstanding roles in such processes. Also because of their capacity to regulate the economy. But we are convinced, and we try to demonstrate in the book, that capitalist actors also play a crucial role in processes of pole formation. We are convinced that capitalist actors and operations generate what we call operative spaces that exist in tension and at the same time can articulate with the political territorial space created by states. So this is the first very important point. You know, Adam Tooze has started to speak of a centrifugal multipolarity in his book on the COVID-19 pandemic shutdown. It's a nice phrase, you know, but what the Tooze means by centrifugal is the fact that multipolarity is not organized, which is a matter of fact. But we also add that multipolarity is centrifugal because operations of capitalism continuously decenter the processes of pole formation. So again, we are confronted here, if you wish, with the vexed question of the relation between state and capital, but within a wide vista of regional and continental spaces. we are convinced that the Belt and Road Initiative regarding China is a good terrain to test and analyze the shifting relations between capital and state. But you can say the same regarding what Daniela Gabler calls Wall Street consensus, which means the US lead reorganization of development initiatives around the world through partnership with global finance. So state capital within spaces that are much wider than state spaces. This raises, of course, another vexed question, which is the question of imperialism. I will not go into the details of our analysis of imperialism. If you look at Russia, for instance, you can think that Russian imperialism today is basically generated by a dominance of territorialism over capitalism, to use Arrighi's conceptual language. But I think there are also other configurations of imperialism are possible and present in the world today. What really matters for an understanding of contemporary forms of imperialism are the convergences and alliances between territorial powers and capitalist actors that take the simplification of international tensions as an occasion for huge profits and may even push toward such simplification. So the process of pole formation is a very complex very complex process. You can see overlappings between different processes of pole formation. You can see, to put it simply, interdependence that is still very strong today. There is the possibility of a simplification of international tensions through the kind of block mentality that is implicit, for instance, in the phrase New Cold War. And I think there are actors, both in Washington and in Beijing, who are willing to embrace such let me come closer to the question of internationalism in the last part of my talk. I was referring, let's say, to two layers of the process of pole formation. Territorial powers, operations of capital. What is crucially important for us is to introduce a third layer in the analysis of the processes of pole formation, and to look at the ways in which social movements and struggles contribute to generate poles. By doing that, it is possible to focus on the contradictions and even antagonists that shape the social dimension of pole formation. I'm talking about social movements and struggles But what I have in mind is not only, open struggles, explicitly political struggles. What I have in mind is, for instance, a reference to the conflicts and practices of subjectivation that crisscross movements of migration and practices of mobility that are a very important aspect of processes of pole formation. So I hope I gave you at least an idea of the way in which I understand the emerging multipolarity. And it is within this emerging multipolarity that the problem and prospects of internationalism must be reframed. To put it simply, we have to look at the regional spaces beyond the nation as fundamental for processes of organization. And I think we have many tools in order to grasp the peculiarity of emerging regional spaces within the multipolar world we are in. I'm thinking of the work of Gayatri Spivak on critical regionalism, but I am also thinking of a book published more than 10 years ago by Quan-Xin Chen from Taiwan, Asia as Matter. I'm thinking of Joyce Liu's idea of a topological vision of the state in an engagement with the Taiwan West. I don't expand on that because I'm running out of time, but let me say that if we take together these contributions, two features of the emerging spaces of multipolarity emerge. These spaces are not homogeneous, are very different from the ways in which state spaces have been historically imagined, and they are not bounded since they are open to the overlapping with other spaces. I think such spaces should be taken as the primary reference for the establishment of channels of communication between struggles. And I think we should reflect upon the prospect of the multiplication and articulation of the resulting coordinates of political action. It is difficult to provide kind of model for such a rethinking of a politics of international. So I will not provide a model. I will talk a bit about what I like to consider an example in the terms that Machiavelli used to employ, which means not something that has to be repeated, but something that can resonate in the present and elsewhere. And this example is Latin America. I'm not at all proposing a kind of idyllic vision of Latin America. The other day, a presidential candidate in Ecuador was shot dead at the end of a political rally, and they have election in 1 week. So I'm very much aware of the tense situation in many parts of the region. But me say that over the last 20, 25 years, what happened in Latin America was particularly interesting. Just think of the situation there in the 1980s, 1990s, after the so-called transition to democracy in the wake of the military dictatorships of 1970. The Washington consensus was the rule everywhere in the region. Depoliticization seemed to be better. But at the end of the 1990s, an amazing series of uprisings and the emergence of social movements of a new time literally opened up a new continental political space. And this was, you know, a real political event. And if you think of the so-called progressive movements that took office in the following decade, the first decade of the 21st century, well, those governments could not have been possible without this violent opening of a new political space at the continental level by uprisings, movements, and struggles. And this is something that continues. This is something that you can trace in the present, you know, in Bolivia, in Colombia, in the international activism of President Lula of Brazil. I would like to say something more on a specific movement that was particularly important in the last decade in Latin America, which means the new feminist movement that emerged, for instance, in Argentina in 2015 under the heading Ni Una Menos, not one less. Some of you may be familiar with that powerful movement that led to something unbelievable some years before, which means a law that legalizes abortion in Argentina. Well, what I find interesting from the point of view of international in that movement is the fact that it was able to open again a new regional space for feminist action in Latin America. And this happened within, you know, some months, a couple of years. There is now in Latin America a Latin American feminism, which is an indigenous feminism, a popular feminism, in a way a queer feminism. It is a completely new political force, you know, that was able to occupy this regional space. And after doing that, in doing that, the feminist movement in Latin America was able to produce resonances in the US and in particular in Southern European countries like Spain and Italy. So, in a nutshell, I think this is a good example of a new international politics. It is, as Veronica Gallo writes, a grounded international, grounded in territories, in values. It is not at all abstract. So, to conclude, allow me to ask back to the way in which I define the problem of international. The forging of a common language capable to address heterogeneous forms of domination and exploitation, and a common desire for liberation. I was saying that this is quite simple, but can also be controversial. I'm aware of the fact that this definition raises a whole set of theoretical and political problems. Is it possible at all to address heterogeneous forms of domination and exploitation? Just think of debates surrounding intersectionality, where very often the qualitative difference between oppression and exploitation is emphasized. I'm thinking of the work of Patricia Hill-Collins, for instance. Well, if there is a qualitative difference, it's not easy to address oppression and exploitation with a common language. So I think we have to struggle with this kind of problems and pitfalls in order to qualify what we mean by common language. And then internationalism has historically attempted to articulate a common desire for liberation. You may ask me, does such a common desire for liberation at all exist? Well, I don't think it exists. I think we are confronted with multifarious attempts to struggle against forms of domination and exploitation, with fragmented practices of liberation, but to speak of a common desire for liberation at the global level doesn't really make sense. Maybe it should be precisely the task of a new internationalist politics, whatever its name, to work toward the articulation, also at the level of imaginaries, of such a common desire for liberation. But I am aware of the fact that the way in which I define the problem of internationalism raises an even deeper question, which means the question of universalism. And I will not repeat again that universalism means modern Eurocentric form is complicit with racism, colonialism, sexism, and so on. I asked, and this is maybe the way in which I will conclude my talk, whether it is possible once again to reinvent universalism. From this point of view, I continue to find very inspiring the work of Etienne Balibar, who emphasizes that universalism must be understood not as a table of concepts and values and ideas, but rather as a terrain of struggle. And what Etienne Balibar adds is that we should become acquainted to consider universalism not as a factor of unification of human beings, but rather, I quote, as an element of conflict between and with themselves and of war. I think this can at least point to directions of research that are constitutive part of any attempt to rethink international. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sandro. We have a pass to continue until 10 past the hour. So that gives us 20 minutes or so for discussion. Let me perhaps start by collecting a few questions, and we'll break. So, Fan, then Ned, and then up the back. We'll have 3 questions, and then we'll see if we're ready for a response. That's it. Is there a microphone going now, or we need to take this one?
If I just speak like this, is it okay, or is it?
I think we can hear here, but
The online, I'll wait for the mic. Thank you. Hi, thank you. Should I just try?
Hello? Oh.
Thank you so much. I mean, maybe I should come closer. I don't know.
Maybe.
Okay. Really inspiring talk. Thank you so much. The one example that came to mind as you were speaking was the recent
My test.
podcast in China, right before the end of the zero COVID policy. As you probably know, it's also preceded by the walkout of a Foxconn factory workers in Shenzhou. I recall some of the news coverage of the movement saying that some of the protesters, for example, were actually singing Internationale as opposed to a national anthem. So as another example to the kinds of revitalization of the concept that maybe you're thinking of. My question was actually more about the kinds of spaces that get opened up by social movements, especially in relation to media communication technologies. As we know, the meme-ification of the blank paper in some ways also brings to mind the creation of the movement Black Lives Matter in the US and going global. So I was just really curious to hear more how we can think more about possibilities of media and social movement. Thank you so much.
We'll take 2 more questions. So we'll have Ned and then the person up the back. Maybe you can go, because this person is closer.
Thank you for the interesting topic. I have a question about engaging with feminist, antiracist, and postcolonial thinkers, which demonstrates an interdisciplinary approach, enriching the discussion with diverse perspectives. My question, how do you intend to incorporate these diverse viewpoints into your analysis? Are there specific theorists or concepts from these fields that you plan to engage with? Thank you.
Okay, and then we'll have 1 more question coming up here.
Yeah, many thanks, Sandro. It's fascinating to hear this overview of this really, compelling new work that you and Brett have been writing for the last months. My question is, what is gained politically and analytically by thinking of social movements as poles? Because underlying your talk is the suggestion that poles are entities capable of articulation of movements. And this presupposes an underlying architecture of protocols that connect otherwise incommensurable struggles. And your examples at the end suggested how this might work. Where social movements enter a kind of dialectical struggle over poles with global hegemons. But what about a common language that is indeed incommensurable with hegemons? Why the language of poles, which you spoke about largely in negative terms? And if we think of, you know, the kind of movements from, let's say, 1999 to this umbrella movement, the squares, I think these were examples of a kind of language, a grammar that enabled articulation across otherwise very diverse geocultural political spaces that wasn't actually in the language of poles.
Yeah, thank you so much from my side as well. I was really eager to hear the talk, and I'm very happy I came all the way from Berlin to hear you speak about this new book. And my question also, you know, picks up on what Ned has been asking and what you have been referring to. So you suggested that you may, in the discussion, talk a little bit more.
That's why I think for people in the back, me no.
Okay. Shall I stand up? Okay, yeah. Sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. So my question is picking up on what Ned asked about the question of poles. And something that you have mentioned before where you suggested maybe we can speak of the question of anti-colonial struggles. Thank you, I'll try this. Yes, works, thank you. So anti-colonial struggles in the history, right? Because there was, of course, this idea of self-determination. And I would like you to elaborate a little bit on this idea of self-determination, because, of course, at some point, when this self-determination has come to maybe even a successful result, then there was a lock-in effect, if you will, that, you know, was restricted to what the nation state made possible and where we are, you know, departing from now. And I think this department from where this struggle was is something that you are trying to understand. And so one solution that you're providing is the pole, right? And in history, of course, you refer to Dugin, who says, okay, civilization is another model of unity. Or let's say a religious community like the Ummah is another unity that provides a community, if you will, that goes beyond a political one. Or Ranavir yesterday referred to the question of solidarity as another set of, at least not a unity, but at least some sort of imaginary of what a community how a community may be constituted, right? And so there's the question of constitution that comes in this, yeah, so, you know, what is that multi-layered pole that we are going to have as a unity, or is that a unity or not? You know, I mean, this is something that I'm, you know, interested in.
So thank you very much for these great comments and questions. Needless to say, media and communication technologies play a crucial role in the mode of operation of social movement and in the ways in which they produce echoes in different spaces. The example of BLM, Black Lives Matter, is a very good example. In a way, I have been looking at the resonances of Black Lives Matter, particularly after George Floyd's assassination in Europe, and I was kind of impressed, you know. It is well known that in the UK, in France, Black Lives Matter inspired kind of new forms of anti-racist struggle. But it is maybe less known that in the Mediterranean, actors engaged in rescue of migrants at risk of drowning have started to employ the language of Black Lives Matter. And that was quite interesting also from the point of view of the critique of a merely humanitarian approach that was prevailing among those actors in previous years. So what happened in the streets of many US cities in 2020 powerfully echoed not only in France and in the UK, but also in the Mediterranean Sea, you know. And I think this is quite interesting. I repeat, particularly because it produced a kind of shift at the level of discourse that has remained. And this could not be possible, of course, without the engagement in media and communication technologies of many activists. So this is a crucial point that I didn't address in my talk, but is part of my and our concern. Regarding feminist approaches, as I was saying, my work on internationalism in the last years is heavily influenced by Latin American feminism and by practices of struggle, of feminist struggle in Latin America, but also by feminist theory coming from Latin America. So what I can add is that in the last 7-8 years, in Latin America, the question of colonialism that you also mentioned has become prominent also for feminist movements. And that was not the case before, you know. Before that, feminism was, in many countries in Latin America at least, very much associated with NGOs and with a middle class perspective. This changed completely over the last years, and this happened also because of the powerful mobilization of indigenous women in the cycle of struggles that I was mentioning before. I come to Nets and Manuela's question. I did not speak of social movements as poles. And poles are not for us the solution, are not for us a kind of normative idea. They are a problem in a way. What I definitely said is that social movements play crucial roles in processes of pole formation, which is, you know, a kind of analytical statement, not a normative formation opens a point of entry into the contradictions and tensions crisscrossing those processes. And maybe a focus on those contradictions and tensions can allow us to go beyond the language of hegemony. I don't know if poles must be considered as unity. This is a very good question. In a way, what we say is that poles are open, to put it simply. So the process of pole formation is never accomplished. But we also take stock of the possibility of a simplification, as I was saying, of the process of pole formation, which means of a closure of poles and of a crystallization of poles as unity. And then regarding anti-colonial struggles, you know, the question of self-determination is a vexed question. I was mentioning empire at the beginning of my talk, and you will remember that there is a chapter in Empire, the dialectic of colonial sovereignty, where Hart and Negri engage with Fanon, they criticize this emphasis on self-determination. You know, I think that looking at Fanon, for instance, the question is more complex. You can find openings in Fanon regarding this topic. And then I think you have to look also at historical processes of anti-colonial struggle. And what I find inspiring, for instance, are diasporic experiences of anti-colonial organizing and struggle. If you look, for instance, at the transatlantic organization of the black diaspora in 34, 35, 36 against the fascist, the Italian fascist invasion of Ethiopia, I mean, you read the papers generated by that mobilization, and you can find a lot of inspiration in that. But thank you again for the questions.
Okay, we have one more. Let's take this question here and see how we like the time. And around here. Okay. Maybe two more, and then we have to think about.
Hello. My question is about more pessimistic visions that would come beyond different sense of territoriality and then different sense of regionalization and multipolarity. Because there are many voices talking about neo-feudal or techno-feudal order that would combine total fragmentation of political body with something that is algorithmic governance or whatever. So how would you comment on those positions? And do you feel technophobic or techno-optimistic or something like that when it comes, when it comes to this other side of a different sense of territoriality, fragmentation, and algorithmic post-democracy or whatever that is?
Sandro, I shall pick up Nate's point, but I will take a different direction and like some insistent out of tune, in the sense that my question is that in the making of pole, whether you are underestimating the role of nations in constituting the poles. If you take the historical course, you know, think of Benedict Anderson's Under Three Flags, where he says that the Filipino revolutionaries, the nation is born by creating the extra-national space. And Anderson's theory is that, which I subscribe to, is that no nation has become independent, no nation has created its own ideology without a transnational thing, and the nation created its own region. Now, if you begin from that and take, for example, Bandung, or Belgrade Summit of the non-aligned nations, you have definite historical examples of how poles are created. And if we do not give adequate value to the national dynamics, then what happens is that at the end of the day, we are left to the fortunes or the forces of the media to say, well, our struggles have spread everywhere. So just to give a black picture of what you said, Black Lives Matter spread in Europe and it became international media, everything. They played very good roles. Within few years, a 17-year-old boy, an Algerian boy, was killed precisely under the same circumstances that supposedly he was trying to cross a traffic junction. What did the French oppressed do and how did they react? Not in the sense of pole, not in the sense of any region. They simply took to the streets, they burnt whatever was available to them, and they did what everybody know, what France excels at, simply coming down on streets and saying, we do not want to have this. There is something basic in this way politics plays out. And there is something basic in the way the nation offers the actors to play their politics out. And unless we integrate that and inherit that as a fundamental question of how poles in histories have been created, we will be left at the mercy of media. We will think that media, new media, these are all helping us, but I'm skeptical in that regard.
Okay. Well, we're not at the mercy of media or at the mercy of time. We can debate with media and time.
So,
But you have no chance to answer these questions.
I'm happy.
So go ahead. 2 minutes.
2 minutes. Okay. So I'm not technophobic. I'm not technophile. I mean, I'm of course aware of the whole discussion about neo-feudalism, the work of Jody Dean, models of. I'm not really convinced by the concept itself, because I have 1 minute. If you look at the economic foundation of the concept of feudalism, well, it is a rent. But the rent is not something new in capitalism. The relevance of rent crisscrosses the whole history of capitalism. It takes different forms in different markets. But I would like to talk more maybe afterwards. And Ranabir, I do not dismiss the national dimension. I agree with you when you talk about Benedict Anderson's book, this interplay between the transnational and the national dimension. What I would like to add is that the nation is not the same everywhere in the world. The nation is not the same in Italy, in India, in Egypt. So I think we need a more nuanced understanding of the nation form as Rabbit, and that in particular the distinctiveness of big nation states today, kind of imperial nation states, should be emphasized. I don't think it is the same to talk about the nation in India, in Brazil, in Turkey, in China, in Russia, in the US, to mention some imperial states, and in Italy or in Chad, in Africa, or somewhere else in Southeast Asia. I think we should not buy the UN principle of the equality of all sovereign nation states. Nowadays, the sheer size of a nation state makes a difference. But just 1 minute.
Sandro, what say you do?
Okay, let's finish up and go to the morning tea.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sandro. Thank you, everybody.